Hi, I'm Michael Ijan with In Focus. Joining us today, Rafi Bagdasarian. Rafi, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Well, this is going to be a fun conversation. I know you have a lot of different experiences in the entertainment industry specifically and the technology space.
Just as a starting point, we'd love to hear how you got into the industry and where you are now.
It started off, my first love is music. And, in college, I had no idea what I wanted to do. So I think my first semester I was like pre-med, and I got a scholarship to Berklee College of Music, but it was too expensive. And I just sort of, aimlessly wandered about until I decided to study music composition. It was really film scoring that I was interested in, but I was also very interested in film. I just recorded a podcast of my own. My co-host on that is an old friend of mine, and he was going to Denison University. And I remember one, winter break, we were having, late night omelets at like Denny's or something. And then he was telling me how he's studying film at Denison University. I was like, ooh, film, like, what is that? And I was in Buffalo. And it always seemed like some distant thing. And I found out that there actually was like a media studies with a film concentration program at the University of Buffalo. So I got into it. And very quickly, like after my first year, and I got into it my junior year, after that first year, I went down to New York City and I worked recording sound mixing because of my music background on an independent film. And there I met a lot of students who were going to SUNY Purchase, which is of the SUNY system, it's probably like the gold standard for film, right? You might have heard of the Purchase Mafia, like actors, actresses, film people that came out of there. And for my senior year, I ostensibly just spent my entire school year working downstate with those Purchase students in New York City. And that's where I really sort of cut my teeth on production in New York City. So from there, I applied to the assistant director's program at the DGA. And I did come out to LA for a few weeks before I ran out of money. Went back to New York, worked on production a little bit longer there. And ultimately, it was a connection through Miramax, which, as you guys may know, was actually founded in Buffalo. So while I was living in New York for about 9 months, I befriended the woman who was like VP of HR at Miramax. And they didn't have anything. And I said, okay, well, I'm moving back to LA this time for good. I've got a car. I've got a nest egg. I've got someone to stay with. And their assistant said, well, when you get there, go to this temp agency. We use them. So I went there, and within a week, they hired me on working for Crystal King, the second assistant to her. She was running exhibitor relations at Miramax at the time. And I worked there for about 3 months. And then I did a really good job there. And they're like, well, the executive vice president and general manager of Buena Vista International needs an assistant. Can you report there? And I ended up staying there for like over a year and a half, full time working at Disney. So that's how I broke into the business. It was really just a little bit of luck, persistence, connections.
Wow, that's so cool. And then I know you were obviously at Sony for a while too.
Yeah, I actually went back to Disney though. So I went back to Disney working in the Walt Disney Internet Group in about 4 years after I'd left. And in between then, I worked for a producer, for an A-list director. And then I worked for World's Wildest Police Videos as an associate producer, a segment producer, which was an interesting experience. And then worked for some law firms, working from pretty major entertainment attorneys. But eventually went back to Disney, and that's where I parlayed me from the entertainment side to the tech side. So at Disney, the second time around, it was a Walt Disney Internet Group. I was overseeing a team of, maybe a dozen artists, designers, animators working on digital content. And some of the stuff we were doing was actually producing like short Disney films for mobile distribution in South Korea and Japan, because they had 3G networks then. We didn't have it here. We would actually sit there. It was like, those old photos you see of Walt Disney with his animators sitting around a whiteboard. We did that, right? We would storyboard, okay, let's do, Mickey and the Sky Pirates. And we created characters, that are now part of Disney canon, classic characters that are adjacent to them. And we would go to like the animation library to get the animation models. I did something once with Marty Sklar, who ran Imagineering. We wanted to use some of those old Herb Ryman art, and he personally had to approve any use of those because it was like the holy grail. Herb Ryman, of course, was the guy tasked with drawing the original layout for Disneyland, but he did a lot of prototyping of rides and whatnot. And I had to pitch this project to Marty Sklar, and he gave me a personal invitation to the Imagineering library, which was like mind-blowing, to just have free reign of the Walt Disney Company Imagineering library in Glendale, and on a personal invitation from the president of Disney. It was mind-boggling. So the first time I was there working at Buena Vista International, every year they do an annual like sales and marketing convention where they bring in their anyone who's like a director and above in sales and marketing internationally. They all descend on like a hotel, and this year it was a Hotel del Coronado. And part of it is, to inform them on what movies are coming around, this year, and they actually bring talent down to present movies. Like I know Jerry Bruckheimer presented Pearl Harbor that year, but John Lasseter, who ended up being the chief creative officer of the company and one of the co-founders of Pixar, was there presenting Monsters, Inc. So we saw like animatic versions of Monsters, Inc. before they had the finished animation. And we get back to the hotel and they're like, hey, Raff, he's like, just hang out with John and, make sure he has everything he needs. And so for like an hour and a half, 2 hours, I was sitting by the pool drinking margaritas with John Lasseter. And I was asking him about story, right? I mean, this is a great opportunity to talk to like a master storyteller. And at the time, a lot of studios, Sony in particular, were trying to, just make things 3D animation and it will sell, right? And talking to him about Pixar, he never mentioned the technology. It was always about the storytelling. That was their laser focus. The technology was just a tool. It wasn't the reason the movies were successful. It was just the tools they chose to use to tell those stories. And Disney, that's one of the things I learned there is that when you do your orientation, they stress it's all about storytelling. Everything the company does has to tell a story. I sat next to a guy who was the director of fountain beverages at Disneyland. He just got hired. And even that, right? Like what sodas you have in different lands and how it's presented, it's all part of a story. And that's one of the things, the most valuable things I learned from Disney was the value of storytelling and also just the Disney quality sense, which you just acquired just by osmosis by being at that company.
I'm curious too. So obviously you were on the storytelling side of things and then you pivoted to more of the technology side of things.
Yeah.
How did storytelling play into the technology?
So I worked on the product development side, which is on the tech side, that is all storytelling. I mean, you literally create user stories and your user journeys to sort of prototype a product to see what is the experience for the person using something, right? And it was very much, working in that space in entertainment at an entertainment company versus like a startup, let's say, where product and technology is more core to the culture. At a studio, it's more sales and marketing, right? So they're used to the sizzle, the sale, So you're constantly at odds with marketing and distribution executives and your colleagues who are like, well, we need more features. That's going to make for a better, more stickiness. I'm like, no, it's really just present really great content and get out of the user's way, right? That's more valuable. So there was always that, that stress between the two. But one of the nice things about being in product development on the tech side is that you need to understand all of the stakeholders' interests, right? So you need to understand marketing, sales, distribution, finance, but most above all, the user journey. That was always what I found to be one of the most fascinating things is the user journey, which is the most important stakeholder as the user, was invariably at odds with sales and marketing. Like, we want the user to do this because it's going to mean more money. And you're like, yeah, but you can't coax them or coerce them because they'll figure it out and they'll have a bad experience. So that's where product and storytelling sort of come in every facet. Like, you have to tell a story to manage up, right? Like, you have to, if you want to convince the finance executive or marketing executive that something's the wrong choice, you could either go, through blunt force, just say no, or you could try to, tell a story as to why you're going to do it a different way. So, storytelling comes into as a valuable skill set no matter what you're doing in every facet of your career and every facet of life.
I'm curious to hear the progression of your career. I understand a little bit about what you're doing now, but what were the steps from where you were at Disney and working in technology all the way to, I know that there was Crackle and some other things in between. So can you tell us a little bit more about your journey?
Yeah, some of it was choice, some of it was necessity. So when I was at Disney, I had a mentor at the time who went to another company, went to Universal Music, and it was a new division being run by Rio Caraff, who's really great. Like, he's got an amazing business sense, but he also gets product, and that was one of the great things about Universal Music. And I had made the commitment to go there, and then someone more senior at Disney said, well, what can we do to keep you here? But then I saw that, Sony was looking for, at the time I was like a director of product, and I applied and I got the job. And it was right around the time that Sony had purchased Crackle. It was Grouper at the time. And not long after I started there, they did the rebrand to Crackle. And Grouper, if you recall, it might have been before both you guys were born, but Grouper used to be there used to be two primary UGV sites, user-generated video sites, YouTube and Grouper, and they were like neck and neck. Mm-hmm. Sony bought Grouper. They were based up in Sausalito, and they rebranded, and they tried to operate it as like an independent entity, but it wasn't long before they said, look, we got to get out of the UGV business. But eventually they turned it into a premium ad-supported video site, right, which was Crackle. And I do remember, the first week I started there, I was sitting in Eric Berger, who went on to become the chief digital officer of Sony Pictures Television. Now he's at Common Sense Networks. And I remember in 2007, we had released something called the Minisode Network, which were like, 30-minute classic TV episodes condensed to like 3 or 4 minutes. And I remember we're talking about bringing Crackle down and making it a streaming video site. And we were like, this is going to be TV, like in the future. Like this is going to be the primary way people watch TV. It's going to be streaming. And we're like, yeah. In fact, I don't know if he's credited with it, but I believe the very first full-length, like 30-minute episodic ad-supported streaming show was thanks to Eric, right? So we were licensing a show called The Ropes from Fox. They produced it. It was a Vin Diesel produced show. And they were going to give it to us in like 6-minute short episodes. And he's like, no, we want it as like 24 minutes. So we have a 30-minute block with ads. And they did. And that's how we presented it. So that could go down as the first time like a Hollywood show, like produced by a studio, was released in full length, 30 minutes or longer on a streaming service. Ad supported. So I was at Sony. We eventually did like Comedians in Cars Getting Coffee was the big show. I somehow, by some miracle, I got to sit in on that pitch, saw firsthand, how that show came to fruition. But I have an entrepreneurial streak. I did well enough in the corporate world, but it was very frustrating. And sometimes that frustration like boiled over. In the corporate world, there's a lot of interest, and you have a business that's supporting thousands, sometimes tens of thousands of employees, and change comes slow. Even if you could see things coming, change comes slow. I'll give you 2 good examples of this, right, at Sony. And this does not speak ill of Sony at all. It was a wonderful experience. Steve Mosco, who ran Sony Pictures Television at the time, I'd follow that guy into war, right, and most of his employees would. But like a good example is when HBO Go came out, which was the TV authenticated version of HBO. I downloaded it the day it came out, and I was watching it. And the next day I was in a senior management meeting, and I was asking my colleagues, hey, did you guys see this HBO Go? It's pretty amazing. And they're like, no. And then I said, Netflix better watch their ass. And our VP of marketing or something scoffed, and he's like, Netflix is digital, HBO's cable. They don't have to worry about anything. No, for the end user, it's the same thing. It's content on your mobile device. But to a studio executive, yeah, there are different teams doing those deals. So from their perspective, they're completely different worlds. But that's where, being in the thick of the corporate world, like you're missing these very obvious signs that the world is changing. And that's why a lot of these large companies can't adapt. And that's when Netflix swoops in and eats their lunch, right? And within months of the HBO Netflix thing, Reed Hastings was on stage at an investor meeting saying our biggest competitor is HBO. He saw it, but studio executives had a hard time seeing that just because they're thinking about it from the business perspective, not necessarily the user perspective.
What is the lesson in that, would you say? Is it think like a consumer? Like just put your head in the mind of consumer?
In fairness, studios at the time weren't doing direct-to-consumer marketing. I mean, they would produce, standees, trailers and everything, but they were for exhibitors to go market to,
sure,
or TV networks to go market. So they and that's actually been a big problem with streaming, right? So even for Disney, right? Disney put streaming at the center of their flywheel, and they have a reason to do that because there's so many other ways to monetize the content. So as long as they have IP, they can exploit it in theme parks, cruises, merchandise, and they have that legacy and they do it really, really well. But for a Max or a Paramount Plus, they don't necessarily have that. And when they got into streaming, they realized very quickly that the cost of acquiring and retaining customers is super, super high, because their entire business was based on effective monopolies. And a good example of that is, the old cable model. If you're Disney and you've got a network of, a dozen channels with ESPN propping them all up, you can go to a Comcast that had a de facto monopoly in their cable area, right? Comcast being a Philly company.
And our client.
Yeah, there you go. They had an effective monopoly over, they literally laid the cables, and there was no other way to get broadband. So Disney could sell, a dozen channels for $7-8 per subscriber, and it was found money ostensibly to them because they didn't have to acquire the customer. They didn't have to do customer support. It was all Comcast, and there was very low churn because you had no other options for cable or broadband. The actual programming now has been decoupled from the actual delivery, so you can get YouTube TV as your virtual MVPD as opposed to having to get the cable, EPG and the grid that they gave you. So now customer acquisition is not a monopoly, and you have to compete for those customers, and they have choices. So that is a really daunting proposition for studios to suddenly say, we're going to direct to consumer now, because it's a whole other ball game that they're not used to. And when all this stuff, all these stories I told you about, like when that happened, like that was before studios went all in on streaming. Sony had Crackle, of course, but it was sort of a toy they were playing with. And I mean, they were serious about it, but it wasn't their main bread and butter. So that's what you're seeing happening in the industry right now. And that's why, all the money that used to come from Blu-ray, DVD, pay TV, windowing, theatrical release, foreign, all that money, I don't want to say all of it, but a large chunk of it has dried up. And it's never coming back. There are other avenues to growth, but the glory days of like Blu-ray, DVD, pay TV, international distribution, windowing for filmed entertainment, I don't think it's ever going to come back. But I can talk about the opportunities that exist with technology, and that's where my company Packet is looking to, move things forward.
I think that's a good segue to hear a little bit about Packet.
Well, so I'll start by saying how I got into the startup space, like in Ouya. So that frustration sort of boiled over. I was working very closely with a friend of my wife's who I became friends with because we worked in the same industry, Julie Ehrman. She's actually now the president of Angel City Football Club and has brought the startup model to professional sports through National Women's Soccer League. And they've done some amazing things. In fact, Bob Iger and Willow Bay, his wife, are majority stakeholders in it now. They invested in it. And I mean, talk about the power of storytelling and celebrity. I mean, they really pulled out all the stops, and they completely rewrote the book of what it means to finance and value a professional sports team. I think they had like $100 million valuation before they played a single game, but it raised the value of every other NWSL team in the league, right? Because they applied this model to it, and it's not overvalued. That's the thing, it's a legitimate valuation given the growth of the sport and the audience they have. And she was at Fox at the time, and we always like sort of were farting around with like different business ideas. And she had this idea for like a game console that, ran on a mobile chipset. And I wasn't actively involved with it. I would like look at the Kickstarter campaign before they did it, and I'm like, oh yeah, that's cool. And so it was more casual, but they launched this Kickstarter campaign, and they had some pretty heavy hitters on the product side, on the gaming side, because they, being at IGN, they were very well connected. Her co-founder, Roy Bahat, was the president of IGN. He now runs Bloomberg Beta, and they did a Kickstarter, raised $8.6 million in 30 days. In backwards on that. I think it was the biggest to date in 30 days. It might still be. The second day of the Kickstarter, when they'd raised like 2.5, she's texting me like, you ready to come over? And I'm like, yes, please save me. And so I went to Ouya right after their Kickstarter, and they closed a Series A round led by Kleiner Perkins, Mayfield Fund, NVIDIA. And I was on a plane to San Francisco to hire our technology team. But the brand, overnight, it was up there in the gaming community. People were putting it up there right there with Nintendo, Xbox, and PlayStation. It was like those three and then Ouya. So there was a period of time where it was a super high-profile brand amongst gamers, especially indie gamers. And that was really the story. It's like Julie and Roy were so, and this is where I kind of, I get very protective of Ouya, is because, some people are like, oh, it was a scam and they didn't really care about indie gamers. It's like, no, they actually cared about indie gamers to a fault, right? Like even in our architecture, we didn't call an app object an app, and the type is either app or game. They were all game objects. So if we had Hulu, that's a game object in the database, and we're talking at a code level, and the type is app. So we even in the code, we were putting gamers first. I even had a bit of a contentious argument where I'm like, we should spend the $1 million to get Netflix on Ouya. And they're like, no, we're doing the Free the Games Fund, right? So they're literally putting their money where their mouth was with respect to indie gamers. Having been there from day one and seeing it firsthand, there was a mission to really cultivate a TV console opportunity for indie gamers to get on the TV. So Packet started off as a direct-to-consumer marketplace for subscription bundling. And there was a lot of interest very early on. We spoke with Disney. We spoke with Paramount Plus. We spoke with a lot of the major streamers very early on. This was around 2020. And they expressed an interest, but they were all just starting to go whole hog into streaming at the time because of the pandemic. And we started 2 months before the pandemic, which was not great timing. But these companies all had other levers to pull to get subscribers, so they didn't really need bundling. They had partnerships with telcos. They had a huge customer base. They had marketing promotions. They had a whole bunch of levers to pull, so they didn't really need it. Notwithstanding that, to launch any direct-to-consumer marketplace, if you don't have the audience, is a fool's errand. And that's something we learned very quickly. There are other companies like My Bundle, for example. They're doing a really great job. They started off primarily as sort of a wizard to teach you what services you should get. And I think most of their revenue was really for marketing. They were helping connect, bundles and subscriptions with telcos, with operators. And they would get affiliate revenue, right? It's a good business. They've done really well. But we had a more technology approach to it, right? Where we were actually bundling the licenses and we'd authenticate. There was a whole tech level to it. We actually got into the Comcast Lift Labs Accelerator. We didn't get into it, but we got into the final round. And I remember being on a call with their CIO and CTO, and they're like, well, who handles the payments? And I said, well, of course we do. That's not what they wanted to hear. And then we sort of hit the reset button after about a year. It existed as an app that was just helping you find what's streaming where, right? And we had some good usage there. And then I brought on, who is now my co-founder, Darren Cross, and we're like, well, let's actually do a hardware. Let's get into hardware. And we thought about, creating a room-aware TV experience, which that dream is still there. But we again realized that getting these apps on your own hardware is next to impossible. And Google TV was really pulling back on giving, startups access to GMS and their app store and everything. So we realized the best opportunity here is to create an API for our bundling logic and open up that API to platforms and marketplaces so that they could use us for handling all the logic of bundling, but they can still use their own payments, their own identity, and we're just really handling the life cycle of that subscription amongst multiple subscriptions. So that's fundamentally what Packet does. So that's what Packet does. It's a TV engagement platform, but we really think that this new fast as a service product is going to be the crux and the core product that people want to use.
It takes such a different perspective from what we do on the content creation side of things and the storytelling side, and then applies it to directly the consumer. And there is definitely a technology component to what we do.
You got to have both, right? Because it's the storytelling is what gets people, right, in the heart. And we're not rational individuals most of the time, right? We're feeling. Storytelling is a really great way to empathize and understand. And it goes back to what I was saying about the studios. A lot of the studios, the people that work in content development, their job is to be empathetic and find universal stories that connect with an audience. Mm-hmm. But in sales and distribution, and less so in marketing, but in sales and distribution, it's more about numbers and data, and it's very easy to lose sight of who is your actual audience? And I would say that was one of the starkest contrasts when I went from the big studio to a startup, is that the studio was trying to establish a social presence with an audience after spending decades, if not a century, doing B2B transactions to reach consumers. Mm-hmm. Going to Ouya, the entire company was spawned from a community event, a Kickstarter campaign. So we actually started with a very, very engaged community, and we're very closely involved with listening to them and interfacing with them and interacting with them. Face to face. I mean, we would have developer meetups, and these are all people who backed us on Kickstarter, and this was our community, right? Developers and fans. It was a complete 180 experience going from a large corporation that was struggling to establish a social connection with their audience to a startup that didn't exist 6 months earlier, that was spawned from a social campaign. And that was a really interesting perspective.
That's so interesting.
What advice do you have for corporate marketers that are trying to get better at that, like that are aware that they need to listen to their audience more?
I feel I'd be talking out of school to lecture to corporate marketers now, because I've been out of the corporate world for so long. I mean, it's been 12 years, which is a lifetime. And I'm seeing a lot of corporations. I mean, good one is Steakums, right? There are some corporations that do really well in social. And I think that there are enough people who came up in social that are ascending the ranks of the corporate world that I think the corporate world is starting to figure it out. A good example of this is, Disney. We're talking about Disney. Disney not only tolerates vloggers going into their parks and shooting, rides and stuff like that. And I know some of the vloggers will be like, they'll self-censor the music in a ride because they think it might get, but I've seen most of them, Disney doesn't shut down a channel if they hear like Pirates of the Caribbean, music playing in the background. But they've even embraced those vloggers, inviting them to media days. They're embracing the community and trusting the communities more, warts and all, to further their brand. Because they realize, if you have something like DSNY Newscast or Mickey Views or Fresh Baked Disney, like they're helping Disney, right? Even if at times they're very critical of Disney, they're doing it from a place of fanmanship and love. And they're doing it because they want Disney to do better. Right? And they're not shutting those channels down. They're listening.
I'd love for you, out of your wealth of experience, if there's any piece of advice for folks that might be entering the industry from your experience you would like to pass on.
Yeah, I mean, I would start with reach for the stars, but also keep your feet firmly planted on planet Earth. The days of being a Spielberg are in that medium are kind of done. It doesn't mean that there aren't other opportunities to achieve that kind of success or even greater, but you're going to have to really forge your own path. And we do live in a multi-channel media ecosystem. So, you have to pull the levers on all of that, social media, whatever the media is you want to be involved with, and just look for ways to tell story. The one thing that has never changed and will never change, regardless of if you're in gaming, you're in virtual worlds, you're in social media, you're in film or television, is storytelling. In that respect, I'm very optimistic for the future of storytelling because there's so many more tools. Now, the tools have been highly democratized, so there's a lot more to sift through, but there are more tools, and I'm really excited about seeing how people are going to leverage those tools to tell stories in new, unique ways. So there's always a market for storytelling. That's a given. It's just that the blueprint has changed dramatically, and it's changing very quickly all the time. The advice I would give is to be open-minded, to focus on cultivating yourself as a human, right? So that you can tell universal stories, and try to be as technically adept and up to date on the tool sets that exist as you possibly can. There was someone that I met recently at a comedy show who has a track record of major success in Hollywood doing, like mechanics, like let's call them puppets, right? It's not puppets, but like, let's say in puppetry.
Sure.
And this person wants to do like a fast channel, right? And do it with a certain genre, within a certain genre. And I was like, okay, well, you could, but if you're going to do that, you're going to need a lot of money. You're going to have like a studio. You're going to have to be pumping out content day in, day out, right? You're going to have to be making new puppets and this and that. And it really wasn't really feasible. But at the same time, I'm like, you know what? Why not create, for your Kermit the Frog character of these puppets, why not create like social channels? Create a Twitch account, create an Instagram account, create a TikTok account for this, not just this character, but other characters as well. But start with this one character, and you can do little 30-second, minute-long, 2-minute little clips within this genre, and you can try things out and cultivate an audience. That's what I would recommend. So there's a story we want to tell with these characters, starting with the Kermit the Frog character. I always use that as the example because he's sort of like the straight man to the foil, right? That's what I would recommend, is like, what is the story you're trying to tell? What are you trying to convey? How are you trying to connect with an audience? And look at all the tools that exist, because in many respects, you can reach an even bigger global audience for a lot less money than in days past. So in many ways, the world is much more conducive to good storytelling, creative storytelling than it has ever been. You just have to look at, different channels and different ways of telling those stories.
Something that you alluded to is authenticity in storytelling. Because there is so much more content out there, it's so important to maintain an authentic voice. And one of the reasons we decided to start this video podcast is for exactly what you just described is, okay, we have a story to tell through Seven Wonders. We do all this client work. We share our client work, but there's so many interesting things going on behind the scenes, how we're building the business, what we're doing, the people that we get to work with that no one gets to see. And so we say, okay, how do we share that with the world and also exercise our skills in doing so? And we looked at the suite of tools that are available to us and we say, well, we know video and we know how to have conversations, so this makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, and distributing video now is never been easier with like standardized formats and HLS. And I remember like when we started distributing mobile content back in like 2007, like doing dynamic streaming based on network conditions, like it was super expensive and super complicated, right? And it's never been easier, right? So video is ubiquitous. It's everywhere. Part of with Packet, we can't do it now just because the product doesn't support it. But one of the things I would love to see is the ability to bring streaming television, not just, videos, like little reels, but streaming television to Instagram, right? To Snapchat. There's no reason why that content can't be there and can't be curated by influencers on those platforms. So that's really what we're enabling is the curation wherever the brand is. And that brand could be talent, the brand could be an influencer, the brand could be like a company. We want to leave it to them to curate what kind of content their audience sees, so that they connect with them and engage with them however they want to be engaged, right? So there's no reason you have to stick to the old models. So that's the advice, is just like forge your own path, given the available tool set.
Thank you again, Rafi, so much for joining us. Again, this is In Focus by Seven Wonders, and we'll look forward to seeing you next time.
Thank you for having me.